Hi everyone, welcome back to This Book Belongs to Pam, and let's talk about all of the books that I read for the month of May. Whew, okay, May was actually a very weird reading month for me in a sense that I started out really slow. I think for the first week of May, I was just not in the mood to read, and I think it had a lot to do with the books that I read towards the end of April. So if you saw my April wrap up, I read the entirety of the Never After series, at least all the five books that are available now. So I read four of those back to back to back to back, and it was kind of a lot. In my last wrap up, I said that I also read the fifth book, which I believe is Crossed in that month, but actually I finished it this month. So that's technically the first book that I finished this month, but I lumped it in with last month because honestly, it was just a blur to me at that point. And I think after reading those books, I just needed a break from romance, from reading in general. So it took me a while to actually pick up my next book and continue reading it. But after that, once I started getting back into reading, the desire to read just flowed back to me, which I'm very grateful for because May is API month, which is Asian American Pacific Islanders Heritage Month. And obviously, I'm not Asian American. I'm in the Philippines. I'm Asian. So I use this month as a way to really highlight and read a lot more Asian books. And I couldn't do that if I was in a reading slump. That said, let's talk about the stats for the month of May. So I just have my story graph here on my laptop. In May, I read a total of 14 books. That includes the crossed books. So technically more like 13 books, but whatever. 14 books, which is 3,570 pages and 21.67 audiobook hours. I listened to a couple of audiobooks this month, which I'm really proud of because I'm trying to put that into my reading routine. I read mostly emotional, tense, and mysterious, which is actually new for me. Usually it's like dark and adventurous because fantasy, adult fantasy is usually what I read, or dark romance, but this one is a little bit different, and I think it has a lot to do with me trying my best to read more Asian literature, which is usually emotional. You'll see later the books that I read, but yeah, emotional, tense, and mysterious. So a change of pace and theme for this month. This one's interesting to me. Format. So I read 50% of the books digitally, which is usually this is like 80% or even 90%. And then I read 29% print, which is four books. And lastly, 21% audio, which is three books. That's amazing. I'm really proud of myself. So this month, my average star rating is 3.77, which is a little above my usual, which I'm very grateful for. I did get a 5-star read this month, which is I'm so happy about. Those are my stats for May, and now let's actually talk about the books that I read. I finished reading A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. This is one of my anticipated releases for 2024, and it wasn't really what I expected it to be, unfortunately. Really quickly, in this book, we are following kind of like a gang led by one Arthi Casimir. She opened up Spindrift with her partner in crime, Jin. And Spindrift is this tea room by day, blood lounge by night. So yes, there are vampires involved in this fantasy book. This one I was expecting fantasy, highs, diverse characters, and I said, yes, give it to me. I want to read it right now. Let's start with the positives for this book. I quite enjoyed the world building of this book, but there's like a caveat to it. I enjoyed the big picture world building, like getting to know about the political landscape of the country that they're in and the relationship of that country with the rest of the other countries, especially because it mirrors real world where they are a country that has colonized other countries. They have a lot of immigrants. There's a lot to be said in the social political landscape of this book, and I really loved that. It reminds me a little bit of Jade City, which is, as I've mentioned so many times before, is my favorite fantasy series at the moment. However, the world building for the actual place, the actual city town setting that they're in, I felt was a little bit vague, and I never really have a good sense of where our characters are operating in. But that aside, my main gripe with this book is that there is so much focus on the romance between the different pairings inside the book, because we are following six people. Interestingly enough, there's only POVs for three people, if I'm remembering correctly. It's not spicy. There's none of that. But every single chapter, if a chapter is like 10 pages long, 8 pages of it will be dedicated to just this character thing about, is she thinking about me? Oh, look at her smile. She winked at me. She's blushing. There's a lot of that. They're like teenagers in heat or something. I don't know. I just found that there was just so much focus on their romantic thoughts. And I don't mind that. Obviously in other highest books that I read, like for example, Six of Crows, there are romantic pairings to it, but I feel like it was more well balanced when it comes to the romance and the actual plot action parts of the book. Are we planning a heist or are we on a Tinder date? Couldn't really tell. And the action parts were written quite weirdly for me. I felt like I never really have a good sense of what each character were doing. For example, if they're breaking into a building. Normally you would get kind of like a play by play of how they're gonna proceed because it's a highest book. I did enjoy the plot twist at the end, and I'm still very, very curious about what is gonna happen to them, all of the cans of worms that have been opened during the last 50 or so pages. Very interested in that. So I am still excited for the sequel. It was enjoyable, but it wasn't as unputdownable as I expected it to be. That is A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. I gave this 3.75 stars. The next book that I read is a graphic novel. It's After Lambana, Myth and Magic in Manila. This is written by Eliza Victoria, and I believe it's illustrated by Mervyn Malonzo. This is a graphic novel set in the Philippines where humans and diwatas, which I guess are like fairies, used to coexist peacefully, but there was an incident, an event that happened that caused, I guess, the destruction or downfall of Lambana, which is the parallel world where Dewatas came from. This resulted into high tensions, and the current government in the Philippines are very anti-Dewatas, anti-fairies, so they enacted this Magical Prohibition Act, essentially banning any form of Dewata magic. So this effectively rendered Diwata somewhat like a second-class citizens because they can be apprehended for using magic, but their entire existence is magical, so what are they gonna do? It doesn't help that there is this mystical, magical epidemic where seeds are growing inside the hearts of humans, and when it grows a certain size, it effectively kills its human host. We are following Conrad, so he is just a regular guy, and he unfortunately has contracted that illness. So he has a seed in his heart, and there's a small window of time where you can actually operate on it and take it out, but after that, there's no cure. So he unfortunately is at the part where there's no cure. So he's in search for something magical to hopefully help him. And he embarks on that sort of journey with this friend slash acquaintance who seems to be very well connected in the Dewata world. I really enjoyed the kind of like gritty urban noir setting of this book. Like even the illustration style reflects how gritty everything is, and I think that was really intentional, especially because a lot of the themes in this book is concerning greed, corruption, and in a way classism. So there is that element to it, and I think the illustration style really captures that. There is so much that I think could have been done with the fantasy aspect, like the mythology aspect of this book. There's a lot that was touched, like the different white ladies, all of the different types of supernatural beings that we know in Philippine folklore is somewhat, sprinkled throughout this novel. But however, because this graphic novel is a standalone, there's really not a lot you can do except like just broad strokes. I honestly think it would have done really well as a full-length novel. There's like plot twists and reveals towards the end that did not hit as hard as I thought it could if we had more page count. But I really did enjoy it a lot. It definitely has that Sandman by Neil Gaiman vibes when it comes to the storytelling and the overall feel. The ending felt more of like a fairy tale, like a cautionary fairy tale type of ending, as opposed to the gritty noir urban setting that we had in the first 70% of the book. For that, I gave this 3.75 stars. The next book that I read is a nonfiction book. I read Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning by Kathy Park Hong. So this is sort of like a collection of essays slash memoirs of Kathy Park Hong's life and experiences as a poet, an artist, and an Asian American. This book, to me, feels like it's divided into two parts. So part one talks about her experience as Asian American and her upbringing, family life, how she grappled with her Asian American identity, all of that. And then part two is more of her, about the author's art, the author's writing and poetry, and how it evolved through her time in school, in university, and afterwards. I think the first part was so strong. Like that first part in itself, it could have been its own book. And I really loved all of the commentary and all of the questions that she posited during that first part. The second part wasn't really my favorite. It kind of came out of nowhere for me. Like, I don't see how they're both part of the same book. So really the second part not my favorite, but the first part was so strong, so good. I think my one takeaway from the first part of the book is that she posits this question: are they being racist to me, or is my work just not good enough? And I think that question is so powerful in a sense that it addresses that being an Asian immigrant, especially in the United States, there's this layers of complexities that you always have to go through. Like all of the mental gymnastics that you have to go through every single time is just insane. Not only do you have to think about, is my work good enough, which is, imposter syndrome. Everyone has that feeling. Like every human being goes through that line of thinking. But then on top of that, you have to think, are they being racist to me about this? Is the feedback I'm getting actually productive, or is it just them being racist and dismissing my work? So there's just those layers upon layers of mental gymnastics that you have to go through before you can even come to a conclusion about your own worth, like the value of your work, your self-worth. So I think it's really powerful that she talked a lot about that. So yeah, I really think the first part of the book is so strong. Lots of eye-opening tidbits. Highly recommend. Gave this one 4 stars. The next book that I read is Si Janus Silang at ang Pitungput Pitong Pusong by Edgar Calabia Samar. I don't know how to translate it in English. Janus Silang and the 77th Pusong. I don't know what pusong is in English, but it's a mythical folklore creature here in the Philippines. This is the third book in the Janus Silang series. Obviously, it's a third book, so I can't really say too much about what happens here because it's gonna spoil the first 2 books. But what I can say is that this book kind of went back to the first book in terms of the storytelling style and I guess the overall feel that I had while I was reading this book. The second book I was a little bit bored by, mostly because there was a lot of info dumping of, the Philippine mythologies and folklores, and I guess it was important, but the way that it was introduced in that book was just very, very much like walls upon walls of info dumping, and it wasn't really engaging in my opinion. But this book went back to the plot, to the action. There was a lot more that was happening in this book, and there is still some of the world building info dumping section, but I think it was less info dumpy and more interwoven in between the plot points and the action parts that has happened. We had a lot more of the fantasy world, the mythical world in this book compared to the first 2 books. So the setting is kind of not split in half, but we do get a little bit of the magical world, which I think is called the Kalibutan. So I actually, because I was really having a hard time with remembering everything, I started taking notes. So I have post-its of the different characters and what they do and whatever their relationships, and then the different acronyms as well, and everything. I'm just taking a lot of notes, and then I have some diagrams of how the world works. Honestly, I feel like this book would benefit a lot from some sort of additional information, like maybe a glossary of the different types of mythical creatures, maybe even illustrations of them, because there's just a lot that I don't know. Mostly because of my own ignorance, but also some of them are not the super common mythical creatures that I think a lot of people would know. Maybe even the cast of characters, because there's a lot of characters. But yeah, really enjoyed this. Can't really say too much about it, but definitely enjoyed this a lot more than the last book. And yeah, gave this one 4 stars. The next book that I read is Dragonfruit by Makia Lucier. So this is actually a book that I read for Jana Katan's Full Moon Book Club because I was invited to be a guest in her book club, and I was really, really honored. Obviously that has happened already, so I'll leave a link in the description box of the live show. So if you want my full spoilery thoughts, you will get that in that live show. In this book, we are following Hannah Lee. She used to be a page for Princess Oliana, so she would, hang out with the princess all day, eat with her, and everything. She came from the founding families of their country called Tamarind. However, one day someone wanted to poison the princess and eventually ended up poisoning Hanali as well. So she and Princess Oliana falls into this coma, and there was no cure for it except dragonfruit. Now, dragonfruit, not the fruit, but dragonfruit, aka the eggs of sea dragons, are known to be kind of magical. So Hanali's father, in his desperation, stole a dragonfruit from the monarchy and fed it to Hanali. And Hanali survived, but then obviously because they stole from the monarchy, they exiled themselves. Unfortunately, Hanali's father passed away. Now she's all alone in very unfamiliar territory. So she just, does what she needs to do to survive. And circumstances brought her back to Tamarind. And surprisingly enough, everyone was really happy for her return. But unfortunately, she finds out that Princess Oliana is still in a coma. So now she embarks on an adventure with her childhood friend, Prince Sam, which is Princess Oliana's son. And they go and try to find another dragon fruit to hopefully save Princess Oliana. My thoughts. I have very conflicted feelings about this book because on one hand, I really enjoyed the setting of the book. It is very obviously set in a tropical island, and obviously the Philippines, we are a tropical island, and I can very much relate to all of the scenery, the feelings, the experience of living in a tropical island. So they talk a lot about the different foliage, the trees, the sea, the fruits, and also they mention a lot about the humidity. That's such a weird thing to like about books, but the way that they portrayed humidity in this book is so accurate. And when I was reading this book, we were in the 40s in our heat index. That's 40 degrees Celsius. So it was very hot and humid when I was reading this book, and I guess I could really just relate to that part of the story. I also really like all of the mythical elements in this book, like the concept of their familiars, where they have like a tattoo of an animal, and that tattoo can move and come to life as their familiar. I found that really fascinating. And yeah, there were a lot of that, like the setting, the theme, the world building that I really did enjoy. However, other than that, there wasn't really anything else that I liked. The characters themselves are okay. We got a little bit of development for the main characters, Hanali and Sam, but I did find everyone else to be sort of like a caricature of different types of characters that you would want to have in a story and not really developed that well. This book is 368 pages long, but the font sizes are huge. So I feel like we only really got about 300 pages of actual content if the font sizes were, the usual sizes. The pacing was so weird. When I got to the last 100 pages of the book, it felt like we were just starting the adventure part of the book, which is crazy. So I was thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to be a series? Am I going to be in for a cliffhanger? But no, there was just really, it was the ending. That was the ending part. And it was so anticlimactic and very convenient. Everything was resolved like that because obviously you only had 100 pages, and maybe because it's YA, I don't think so. There's like YA books that go into a little bit more detail and a lot more thought and planning into wrapping up the book, but this one just was just so everything was just so easy for them in a sense. I really couldn't get behind the romance in this book as well. I wish it wasn't there. I think if they just focused on them being very, very good childhood friends, kind of like long lost best friend type of thing, I think it would have made this book much stronger, because you wouldn't, have to force the romance in it. Because, they could care very deeply for each other and not be romantically interested. Okay, that can happen. So I wish we had that. But yeah, I don't know. There was just a lot of like plot points as well that were kind of shaky. And if I really scrutinize it, it would fall apart, in my opinion. But yeah, I'm trying to not overthink it because it is a YA book. Maybe it's just meant for very young audiences to just enjoy the world building and to relate to it. And for that, I appreciate it. So I gave this one 2.75 stars. So that's Dragonfruit by Makia Lucier. The next book that I read is Five Broken Blades by Mai Horland. I read this on my Kindle and I love it so much. I think this is what I was looking for when I was reading A Tempest of Tea. This is very, I guess, broad strokes, is kind of like a fantasy heist novel, and we are following this group of unsavory characters as they team up to try and kill the king. However, there's one slight complication. The king is apparently immortal. So how do you kill an immortal king? They're gonna try and find out. So I really enjoyed this book a lot. If A Tempest of Tea focused more on just developing the characters on their own, their motivations and their skills, I would have loved it a lot more, because that is what this book did. This book really went into every single character and why do they do the things that they do? Why would they be perfect for this job? What are their hesitations? What are their motivations? What are they thinking of as they try and formulate a plan for this job? There is romance in this book. It wasn't the focus of it. It can be like a driving force for some of the characters in this book, and there are definitely characters who are really more into the romance aspect, but it wasn't the focal point of the book. We had political intrigue, we've got a little bit of the fantasy element, we've got kind of very reluctant found family vibes. So not in the same way as Six of Crows, that obviously they're not like super duper family, but eventually they end up becoming that. But this book, even towards the end, everyone was still very reluctant and hesitant to trust each other, which obviously poses a bunch of complications in their operation. This book just really did a good job in creating that atmosphere. It's not perfect, especially in the world building aspect. I found the world building to be a little bit loose and vague and not as immersive as I want it to be. I don't really have a very good sense of the technological advancements, the culture, and things like that. I didn't have a good grasp of it in this book. But the character work, I love it so much, and that really pulled the book for me. So I gave this one 4.25 stars. Really like it. Excited to read the sequel, which is coming out next year. So yeah, that is Five Broken Blades by Mai Corlin. The next book I read is a recommendation by Carrie Can Read. So I saw her post about this book in her Instagram stories, and I was really curious, and it was a short-ish book, so I thought, why not? So I read Mother of Strangers by Swad Amiri, and oh my gosh, this book is so good, so well written, but it's also so heartbreaking. So this is a historical fiction novel set in 1940s, like 1945, 47 Jaffa, which is part of Palestine at the time. We are following a young 15-year-old teenager named Subi. So he is a very talented mechanic, and he's known to be like the best in his city. So he has been working in a garage and just, trying to earn enough money, because he is actually very much in love with this girl named Shams. and he wants to marry her. So for that, he wants to save up money and everything. However, because obviously in 1947 in Jaffa, things are very shaky in terms of the political landscape. There is a lot of talk about British forces pulling out from Palestine and the influx of Jewish immigrants from all over the world into Palestine, and just the tensions are really rising. The writing style reminds me of The Stationery Shop by Marian Kamali, which I also really love, where you're following obviously this young man and his, teenage love, but the things that are happening around him are a lot more bigger than he is. Like the tension between the Palestinian government and the British government, and all of the influx of Jewish immigrants, and how the city is starting to transform from a place where everyone is coexisting peacefully, and suddenly things starting to change because of forces that are kind of outside of their control. And I really like how our main character is not this person who is at the forefront of, the action, the conflict. He's not the type of where he's like a soldier and he's gonna fight for his country, but he's just a regular person. He's a regular citizen who has, his wishes, his dreams in life, and how things can very quickly change for him, how he has tried to adapt, has tried to survive, and has tried to really live through everything that's happening, and how he's coping with everything. Because really, a lot of the people who are affected by these are just regular citizens. A lot of the decisions made by these politicians, these people in power, how do those decisions affect this majority group of people trying to survive? And I think it's really well written in a sense that it's not black and white. You have this main character who have very conflicting feelings about what is happening. There are moments where Subi was just like grateful that it's not happening to him, directly to him and to his family, that it doesn't feel real because it's not happening to him. But then when things hit them, then he feels like, oh gosh, this is really bad, what's happening is bad. And I think that's just a very realistic picture of what it's like to be just a regular citizen. And what does it mean, like what kind of power do you have to fight, like what are your avenues? And I think this book really explores that. And also, one of the things that I learned in this book are some of the Palestinian traditions, like culture, that have been practically erased today because of the occupation that is happening right now. I think this very up close look at the life of a very normal, regular person, teenager, citizen is very empowering, because often we kind of think of these very big world events as something that's like, from a very 10,000-foot view of like, it's countries warring with other countries, countries occupying other countries, and it's the policy, the British policy, the American policy. We're thinking about it in such big terms, but we forget like the very, very real lives of people that are affected by these decisions that other people are making for them. And I think that's just really powerful to learn about. So yeah, I highly, highly recommend that you read this book. I think you will learn a lot. This is obviously historical fiction, but it's very much rooted in reality. And I believe the author of this book lives in Palestine, and also she interviewed a lot of different people who have contributed to the making of the narrative of the story. So yeah, really highly recommended. I gave this book 5 stars. Mother of Strangers by Swad Amiri. The next book I read, still also along the lines of the Asian struggle, which is probably why my stats this month has a lot of like emotional books up front, because of all of the Asian literature that I've been reading. And with Asian literature comes the Asian struggle. So I read Butterfly Yellow by Tanha Lai, and this is a fictional novel. We're following this girl who lives in Vietnam, but obviously during the chaos of the war, they were trying to seek refuge in different countries, more specifically the States. So she went to the airport with her baby brother in hopes of trying to get on a plane to go to the States and, seek shelter and safety in that country. Unfortunately, the chaos took over and the rescuers took her baby brother, but couldn't take her. So they were separated at the airport. Like, no idea where his brother is gonna be taken, no idea who took them. The person who took her brother just gave her this one business card with an address, and that's it. They were devastated. They didn't know what to do. There was really nothing at that point in time that they could do because everything was just so chaotic. They spent the next 6 years trying to gather up enough money and trying to find ways to get to the States to hopefully reunite with her baby brother. So 6 years has passed, and she finally was able to go to the States and, immigrate. And she tried to look for her brother, and like right at the moment that she was able to get out of the refugee camp, she went looking for her brother. So she doesn't really speak English, she doesn't know much about the culture, the people, but she, in her journey in trying to find her brother, came across this cowboy. They kind of reluctantly worked together to try and find her brother. However, when she did find her brother, things are not what she expected. I listened to this on audiobook, and I was just okay with it. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it a lot. It talked a lot about like the struggles of immigrants. You've got the prejudices, you've got the racism and everything, especially because our main character couldn't really speak English that well or at all. It kind of like just follows her journey into trying to stand her ground in a country that is so hell bent on like molding her into their version of what it means to be a citizen of that country. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about this. I didn't feel too connected with any of the characters in this book. It's a good story that tackles those struggles, and it has quite an ambiguous ending as well. And I guess it just speaks to just the reality of what it means to be a refugee. I gave this one 3 stars, so very middle of the road for me. Yeah, that is Butterfly Yellow by Tan Halai. Next book that I read, I think after reading a lot of historical fiction or literary fiction, I kind of just wanted to go back into something a lot lighter. So I read romance and I read King of Pride by Anna Huang. This is the second book in the Kings of Sin companion series that she has. The first book is King of Wrath. In this book, we are following Kai, who we kind of know from the first book, and Isabella, who is the best friend of the female main character in the first book. So we kind of know of them. They had like a couple of quirky, funny scenes in the first book where Isabella is always getting caught by Kai talking about the most ridiculous things like glow in the dark condoms and strawberry flavored condoms or whatever. So Isabella is this very creative, fun loving, very expressive person. She works as a bartender in the Valhalla Club, which is a very exclusive members only club that Kai kind of manages as part of like the managing committee. Now Kai is from a very well-off, well-known family who owns this media conglomerate. So they own a bunch of like entertainment brands, newspapers, things like that. And Kai is set to be the heir, the successor to the CEO, because the CEO is his mother, and because obviously nepotism, Kai is kind of expected to be the CEO. But Kai himself is a very hardworking person. He has a lot of pride, king of pride. So he works hard to be the best in every single thing that he does. So he's this kind of very snobbish vibe type of person where he translates books into Latin for fun. He likes to read the classics. He has these glasses. He's kind of seen as this very stuck up type person. Obviously the opposite of our girl Isabella. I did like this book a lot more than King of Wrath. We got a little bit more character development in the sense that we really get to know Kai and Isabella separately, and what are their motivations, their fears, their insecurities, and the things that I do want to do in life. And I think we got a really good sense of that, which I really enjoyed. I also think that their relationship blossomed a little bit more organically than the couple in the first book. I feel like the couple in the first book was kind of like they're like hate to love, but in a way it's also like insta lovey. But in this book, we got a little bit of like a build up. They had really good banter. They're always teasing each other. They were kind of in each other's circles all the time because obviously their best friends are together. So I thought that the way that their relationship progressed was kind of a lot more natural. So yeah, it was a really fun read. I blazed through this book. I think I read this in like 2 sittings. So yeah, I gave this 3.75 stars. That is Cake of Pride by Anna Huang. I'm actually so very excited for the next book, which is King of Greed, because we have a married couple who are kind of falling apart. The next book that I read is Penance by Eliza Clark. This is a book that I read because it is part of JB's Library's book club, but I actually missed the live show, so whatever. But anyway, this book was recommended to me by Cherry for my 12 Rex 12 Friends challenge. And how do I explain this book? So this is, I would say it's kind of like a literary fiction with some mystery aspects to it. But definitely I would classify this more as a literary fiction. This book is fictional, but it reads like a non-fiction. The first page of this book literally says that this book is an examination of the 2016 murder of teenager Joan Wilson by 3 girls attending the same high school. That kind of like sets the tone for this book. It's meant to be read. It has the vibe of a non-fiction book, and that's how it's written, that's how it's structured, but it's a fictional, like the entire thing is fiction. I was really confused for a hot minute. Like I had to do some researching just to make sure, is this fiction or non-fiction? But yeah, it is a fictional book written to read like a non-fiction. We are, as I mentioned earlier, following this crime that happened in 2016 where 3 high school girls kidnapped, torture, and burned their classmate, Joan Wilson. It kind of chronicles the events leading up to that and tries to create a profile of each of the girls that are involved in this crime and the story, and tries to, I guess, figure out their motivations. Why did they do what they did? Was there something in their family life, something in their background, something in their experiences in this small town that caused them to commit such a violent and heinous crime? However, that very first page that I read also mentions that this book was technically pulled out of the fictional library, the fictional world that they're in, because the fictional author of this nonfiction book, Alex Carelli, actually did some shady shit in order to get all of the story that he put in this book. He was kind of accused of taking the stories that, the victims, the families of the victims confided in him, and kind of like twisted it in a way to create this narrative that he wanted to write about. And also some of the material were apparently, taken and reproduced without consent because it wasn't really given to him. He just bribed someone to get it. There's that kind of layer of commodification of true crime on top of this book that is talking about a true crime. When I was reading it, I was hyper conscious that I am reading a fictional book that talks about a true crime in their world, but at the same time, it is commentary on how true crime has been marketed and capitalized on and commodified as a form of entertainment. Like when I was reading this book, I was thinking in my head, am I reading this book because I am just, I'm reading a book, I'm curious about the ending, what happens, it's a fictional book, but at the same time, it feels like I am participating in this commodification of true crime, and it was just a really odd reading experience for me. There is a mix of real and fictional crimes because it talks about like serial killers and things like that. So the ones that we know of that are real serial killers, like, Jeffrey Dahmer and the Columbine shooters. Then at the same time, there are cases here that are just fictional. Maybe it's based on real things, but it's fictional in this book. And then I was searching about those fictional cases just to check if they're real, just to check what's the actual thing that happened. And then I catch myself and I think, am I Googling about this fictional crimes and checking if they're real because I just want to, gain a better understanding of the book? Or am I Googling them because I have this perverse curiosity the way that a lot of people who are into true crime has, which admittedly I was into true crime for quite a bit, like obviously in the height of Serial the podcast. Now I'm a lot more careful and a lot more, I would say, discerning when it comes to the true crime media that I consume. So yeah, I was just constantly catching myself like reflecting on that, and that really made for such a weird reading experience. Initially, I really thought that that was just such a clever way of writing this book, because at the same time, it's kind of weird that you're writing about the, I guess, the ethics of, true crime media in a media format while discussing a true crime type of story, even though it's fictional. So initially I was like, wow, that's like some meta thing, and that's like such an interesting way of creating a discussion around that, and it really made me think and reflect about that. But then I just found out, like literally this morning, while I was, browsing through the discussion during the live show for Jamie's book club, that the actual crime in this book, the one where the three high school girls like kidnapped, tortured, and burned alive another high school girl, is actually based on a true crime. It was not really mentioned even in the disclaimer or in an author's note somewhere. It wasn't really mentioned. And now it's kind of weird. Is that intentional, where she was inspired by true crime and then wrote a book that kind of like examines the ethics of true crime media? Or is that at the same time kind of like jeopardizes her entire thesis on it, because the fact that she has commodified this true crime in order to write a book that's talking about the ethics of true crime media? So that I'm kind of conflicted. I will give it 4 stars just because of the storytelling and the way that it made me reflect and think and really criticize and examine my own behavior. I was really hooked by it. I'm gonna settle for 4 stars right now, and I think this book demands a bit more discussion. I need to think about it more and maybe talk to other people about it. It's definitely very heavy, and there's a lot of themes here that are very hard to digest. I guess that's part of the, but yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Penance by Eliza Clark. I guess on a somewhat lighter note, the next 2 books that I read are webtoons. So I read the first and second volume of Lore Olympus by Rachel Smythe. This I read as part of, Battle of Five Worlds. I just wanted to read a lot more books to fulfill some prompts, and thankfully this fit the bill. I read it in the webtoon format. This, if you're not familiar, is a retelling of Hades and Persephone. In this webtoon, it's kind of like an urbanized setting as well, where you've got offices and jobs and cell phones and things like that. It's like the modern world. And you have Hades, who falls in love at first sight, with Persephone, who is I guess a minor goddess, and she's kind of new, and they kind of bond together, and they have this thing that's going on between them, but they both have their issues, so we're kind of just following that. I've only read the first 2 volumes, which correlates to the first 49 or 50, I think it's 49 chapters of the webtoon. And it was enjoyable. It was fun, very quick to read. I'm not a big fan of the illustration style. Sometimes I like it in some like panels or scenes, and other times I feel like it was kind of confusing. But it's fun. It's easy to read. I'm excited to read more of it. I really enjoy the modernification of the Greek mythologies and the people, and how it reflects in a modern world. I always like stories like that, where you take something ancient and try to like retrofit it into the modern world. I love that. I gave the first volume 3.5 stars and the second volume 3.75 stars. Yeah, that is Lore Olympus by Rachel Smythe. The final book that I read, or rather listened to this month, is The Locked Door by Frida McFadden. So I did listen to this on audiobook, and it is my first Frida McFadden book. She's a very well-known mystery thriller writer, I believe. And this book, we're following a surgeon who we know is the daughter of a very famous serial killer. Her father killed, I believe, like 20 plus women in the Bay Area, and he has been put away. He's in prison. However, 26 years later, a copycat killer has surfaced, killing women, same type of women, same MO, like same signature as her father, but her father is in prison, so she's not sure what's happening. And then some weird things start to happen to her where it kind of feels like she's being framed as the killer. So she's trying to figure out what is going on. How do I get out of it? Everyone's a suspect. So I think what I really appreciated about this thriller is that everyone is kind of like fair game. Everyone is kind of like sketchy and shady. You can't really say that, oh, this person is safe. While I was listening to it, I was so conscious of the fact that Frida McFadden is trying to lure me into certain like traps and red herrings and trying to make me think that it's this person when it's actually this person. I did guess who it was, but I didn't guess why that person was doing all of this thing, like the connection between that person and Nora. But I did guess who it was, which was a really fun feeling. Very junk food type of thriller. Definitely just something I could listen to quickly while doing, chores and stuff. And yeah, it was like a fun way to cap off the month, and I gave this one 3 stars. I am excited to read more Frida McFadden. I feel like she writes really fast paced, engaging books that will like pull you out of a reading slump. So now that I know that, I'm probably gonna be reading a lot more of her books. And yeah, that is The Locked Door by Frida McFadden. Those were all the books I read for the month of May. I did pretty good in all of the, I guess, readathons that I joined in. I joined Battle of Five Worlds and also Asian readathon and also Stan Asian authors. So I kind of did a good job this month. But now I feel like I am over all of the readathons. Like, I have been in readathon mode since April, and I just wanna mood read for the rest of June. So I think for June there's not gonna be any readathon that I'm participating in. I'm just mostly gonna be focusing on the videos I wanna film as well as books that I wanna read. So just expect, I guess, a random assortment of books for June. But yeah, I am so happy about the books that I read this month. If you're gonna be taking any book recommendation from me for this month, I hope that you read Mother of Strangers by Swad Amiri. I really love it. It is definitely life-changing and eye-opening. Highly recommend that. That was my May. I hope you had a really good reading month. I hope that June is a lot better for you, and thank you so much for hanging around and chatting with me about the books that we read. And let me know in the comments what your favorite book of May was, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Baby